we demand the highest quality from our games. Normally, Nintendo does not publish the most games, but regularly, we are responsible for the most popular games.
Since the 80s, Nintendo has shaped and influenced the video game industry. For home consoles, it began with the Famicom in 1983, released outside of Japan starting in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. For handhelds, it began with the Game & Watch series of products, followed by the more universally successful Game Boy in 1989. The 90s continued Nintendo's efforts to define gaming with the release of the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, and the multiple updates to the Game Boy handheld. Even as Nintendo's hold on its audience and third-party support slipped, Nintendo's reputation as a company focused on fun experiences with its strong cast of first-party titles and dominance over the handheld market kept them from leaving the games industry as a whole. Entering the 2000s, Nintendo's home console market had a huge hill to climb, going up against what the PlayStation 2 had offered its consumers and what Microsoft was promising with its first video game console, the Xbox. All while Nintendo faced pressure from within the company to make a handheld that could keep up with competitors like the Lynx, Game Gear, WonderSwan, and Neo Geo Pocket. 2001 would become one of Nintendo's biggest years. It would be the year of Nintendo's newest home console and newest handheld. And it would be the year that determined how Nintendo would embrace gaming in the 21st century. The Game Boy, at the time, was Nintendo's most successful hardware release, but despite how successful it became, it was still technically the most inferior of the handheld consoles. When Nintendo was ready to catch up with the technology that made the other handhelds notable, they started work on a handheld that would offer the same advantages the Game Boy had while improving on the hardware itself. Gaming publications picked up on this and reported about a successor to the Game Boy, then known as Project Atlantis, developed by Satoru Okada, co-creator of the original Game Boy. Rumored specs of Project Atlantis include a custom ARM 710 CPU, improved graphics and battery life, and full-color displays. According to Okada, Project Atlantis as it was became too expensive to produce. So in order to keep up with evolving possibilities of the handheld market, the Game Boy Color was released in 1998, featuring a full-color display and a processor faster than the original Game Boy. But the Game Boy Color alone wasn't enough to appease the higher-ups at Nintendo or software developers who were not impressed with the minimal improvements between the original and Color Game Boy hardware. Rumors began circulating about two successors to the Game Boy at Space World 1999 in August. The first being a version of the Game Boy Color with online capabilities, and the second being hardware almost similar to what Project Atlantis had promised. Finally, in September 1999, the Game Boy Advance was announced. At the time of the announcement, these were the specs promised for the Game Boy Advance. The specs were compared to the technology that powered cell phones at the time. In August 2000, the Game Boy Advance was officially revealed to the public. Then Executive Vice President of Nintendo, Atsushi Asada, revealed the Game Boy Advance in a private presentation highlighting how the GBA will retain the simple and straightforward approach the original Game Boy had. Asada emphasized that the GBA would be a 32-bit 2D handheld. The specs during this presentation more or less matched those that were revealed a year prior, with the biggest difference being the maximum amount of colors initially promised with what would actually be delivered. The Game Boy Advance would also have the ability to play all games released on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. While originally scheduled for a 2000 release, the Game Boy Advance would be shelved until 2001 to help Nintendo keep up with the ongoing demand for Game Boy Colors. It was during this event that Nintendo had another major announcement to satiate the public. Coinciding with the reveal of their handheld successor would be the reveal of their home console successor. Throughout the lifetime of the Nintendo and Super Nintendo, the consoles were supported by strong first and third-party lineups, and strong sales to rival their companies. This all changed with the release of the Nintendo 64. While still successful with their first-party lineup, the Nintendo 64 lost much of their prior third-party support to Sega and Sony with their systems. The earliest reports of the GameCube's development came in 1998. Through a lawsuit from Silicon Graphics to ArtX, the first rumors of Nintendo's home console successor would leak. ArtX consisted of people who had left Silicon Graphics, all led by former Nintendo employee Wei Yen, who had been instrumental in leading the development of the Nintendo 64. ArtX was founded in 1997, then acquired by ATI in 2000. ATI and Nintendo partnered together to work on what was then known as Flipper. The biggest difference between Silicon Graphics working on the Ultra 64 to ATI working on Flipper was that the people who worked on the Ultra 64 at Silicon Graphics did not have as much experience with 3D technology. Fast forward to the late 90s, where the same people who had worked on the Ultra 64 had newfound experience in 3D technology, with some having moved on to Nintendo directly. Nintendo did not hide the fact that they were developing a new home console, but were not ready to disclose any details even in the wake of the PlayStation 2's launch in 2000. Over the course of the next few years, Flipper would undergo multiple codenames, with Dolphin being the codename most commonly used in publications reporting on the console's development. During E3 1999, Howard Lincoln, then chairman of Nintendo of America, publicly revealed the first details of Dolphin. He promised that the graphics would at least match the PlayStation 2's potential, would be affordable, a 400MHz CPU, which would be more than triple the CPU of the Nintendo 64, and to the delight of the press, this would be the first Nintendo home console to not use cartridges. However, Lincoln did not disclose what format the games would use. Like the Game Boy Advance, Dolphin was also slated for a 2000 release, but delayed to the following year. According to Hiroshi Imanishi, then general manager of communications for Nintendo, Dolphin needed to be more affordable, and the biggest reason for Dolphin's delay, there needed to be more time to develop software for the system. In August 2000, at the same event that Nintendo revealed the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo also revealed Dolphin under its final name, GameCube. In addition to the specs and some demos of what GameCube games could look like, it was revealed that the GameCube would be played off of small optical discs developed by Panasonic, then known as Matsushita. A more detailed demonstration of the GameCube would be slated for E3 2001 in May, which would also serve as a platform to promote the North American and PAL release of the Game Boy Advance 2 months after the GBA's release in Japan. The stage was set for 2001 to become the biggest year for Nintendo's hardware. No other year saw Nintendo release a new home console and a new handheld console. And E3 2001 would be where Nintendo showed off what players outside of Japan could expect with the Game Boy Advance, and what the world could expect with the GameCube. In all territories, launch titles for the Game Boy Advance included Castlevania Circle of the Moon, Fire Pro Wrestling, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, GT Advance Championship Racing, Konami Crazy Racers, Pinaby Wings of Adventure, and Super Mario Advance. Some territories got launch titles that other territories did not, and many of the launch titles in Japan were exclusive to Japan. The launch price in North America was $99.99, with the games ranging from $29.95 to $39.95. Since Japan had already launched the Game Boy Advance, and with the launch in other territories being 1 month after E3, Nintendo kept promotion of the Game Boy Advance low-key. Much of Nintendo's presence at E3 that year, including their entire press conference, was centered around the GameCube. Nintendo revealed details about the GameCube, hoping to make it stand out when up against the year-old PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. Nintendo gave their audience trailers of games launching with the console on launch date or shortly after, concept trailers of upcoming games, testimonials from third-party developers touting how easy it is to develop for the GameCube, a September 2001 launch for Japan, November 2001 launch for North America, and a price tag that made the console much cheaper than both the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Nintendo also showed off what would be a Japan-exclusive version of the GameCube called the Panasonic Q, which added DVD, movie, and CD playback. Japan and North America's launch titles were Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race Blue Storm, and Super Monkey Ball, Sega's very first game to be released on a Nintendo console. While not a launch title, the GameCube would still release what would become its best-selling title before the year ended, Super Smash Bros. Melee. This game would indirectly lead to the Fire Emblem franchise being released outside of Japan for the first time thanks to the inclusion of fighters Marth and Roy. The game would also solidify the GameCube controller as being the most preferred way to play future releases in the Smash Bros. Franchise for players, mostly professionals, of Smash Bros. Tournaments. The rest of the world would get the GameCube between March and August 2002. The Game Boy Advance would have, at the time, the fastest selling launch of any console. While the Game Boy Advance didn't sell as many units in its lifetime as the original Game Boy, it would still end up being Nintendo's fourth highest selling hardware behind the original Game Boy, the Nintendo Switch, and the Nintendo DS. The best selling Game Boy Advance games would all be the third generation Pokemon games, including the remakes of the first generation titles Fire Red and Leaf Green. In 2003, the Game Boy Advance SP would be released. The SP model would add a rechargeable battery, improved display, and a clamshell design that almost mimicked the appearance of the original Game Boy when fully opened. The SP design was Satoru Okada's original pitch to his superiors before the official launch of the Game Boy Advance. In 2005, the Game Boy Micro was released, which would be Nintendo's last hardware to use the Game Boy name. Game Boy Micro would also be so small that it could fit in the palm of your hand. It had nearly all the technical specs of the Game Boy Advance SP, but would remove the backwards compatibility support for Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and would support custom faceplates that could be swapped out at any time. The GameCube would hold its own against the Xbox, but both consoles would be no match for the success of the PlayStation 2. Third-party support did improve over the Nintendo 64, but it did not last for the entire duration of the GameCube. It would end up becoming Nintendo's lowest-selling home console until the release of the Nintendo Wii U. But the GameCube was still regarded as a successful console among Nintendo fans for introducing new franchises and being home to some of Nintendo's most popular games. Some of these titles would be re-released in future consoles. Others would remain exclusive to the system, causing those games to skyrocket in value among resellers. GameCube games would join the Nintendo Classics lineup for the Nintendo Switch 2, launching with F-Zero GX, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, and Soul Calibur 2. As of this production, Super Mario Strikers, Luigi's Mansion, Chibi Robo, and Wario World have been added to the Nintendo Classics GameCube library, with more titles planned for future updates. In 2003, Nintendo released the Game Boy Player add-on for the GameCube, allowing most Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games to be played on a big screen, similar to how the Super Game Boy used the Super Nintendo to connect Game Boy games to the big screen in 1994. Nintendo would continue to focus on marketing their games as fun, unique experiences for all ages, when compared to how Sony and Microsoft would market many of their popular games. Nintendo's approach to marketing themselves would help prepare them for their next generation of consoles with the release of the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DS. While the Wii U and the 3DS weren't as successful, Nintendo bounced back with the release of the Switch, Nintendo's best-selling home console. With the Switch 2 still in its launch year as of this production, it remains to be seen if Nintendo's vision of innovative gaming for all ages will live up to the success of the first Switch console. The launch of both Game Boy Advance and GameCube gave Nintendo one of its most memorable years in the gaming market. The next step to evolve their dominance in the handheld market, and the opportunity to show that consoles don't have to have the most detailed graphics or support for other media formats to be a success. Nintendo going into the 21st century, starting with the Game Boy Advance and GameCube, would be defined as a new direction for the company. A direction that would lead to innovation, more unique experiences, and more memorable games.
Introducing Nintendo 64, the future of video gameplay. 64 bits of processing power, packed with power, instant 4-player compatibility, and memory expansion for future growth, all built into a sleek new compact design. We call it the Fun Machine. Nintendo 64 incorporates the world's first analog control stick integrated into the revolutionary new ergonomic controller.
3D control for a 3D world.
And the removable memory pack saves game progress and enables you to compete on your friend's Nintendo 64 system by using your own saved data. So what does all this mean? Better games and even better reality-based gameplay.
Infinity 2101, more what begin.
What happened?
Someone set up us the bomb. We get signal.
What?
Main screen turn on.
It's you.
How are you, gentlemen? All your base are belong to us. You are on the way to destruction.
What you say?
You have no chance to survive, mate, your time. Ha ha ha. All your base, all your base, are belong to us. All your base, all your base, are belong to us. All your base, all your base, are belong to us. All your base, all your base, are belong to us. All your base, all your base, all your base, are belong to us. All your base, all your base, justice. Take off every zig. Zig. You know what you're doing. Take off every zig. Zig. You know what you're doing. Take off every zig. Zig. For justice. Take off every zig. Zig. You know what you're doing. Take off every zig.
Huh? Yo, you won. Kazi been pecking on you again? You're really like totally useless, aren't you?
Oh, shut up, Puma.
But you won. There's something you can do about it, I think. Come on, let's go. Give it a shot.
Huh?